All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us today. Today I have with me Lydia McGrew. We're going to be discussing the reliability of the Gospels. In particular, we're going to be looking at this issue, whether the Gospel writers used what we could call fictionalizing literary devices, devices that changed what we as modern people would consider facts and made them appear to be something other than what actually literally happened. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytical philosopher, homeschooling mother, author, and wife of philosopher and apologist Timothy McGrew. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She has published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and its applications to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in her books, which we will be discussing today. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to reach people all around the world, whether they be believers or unbelievers. We ask that anyone listening today approach the material with an open mind, that they not just dismiss what we have to say because they don't like the material. We ask that you be with us today, that you guide our discussion, and you give us the words to say. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All
Amen.
right. Did you want to say something?
No, I said amen.
Oh. Excellent. So before we dive into the main subject matter, to give some people time to show up and to get to know Lydia a little better, I'm going to ask her some questions about her background. So can you tell us just a little bit about your upbringing, how you came to know Jesus, stuff like that?
Sure. So I was adopted when I was 7 months old as a baby by Baptist parents living in Chicago. They were not wealthy at all. My father was a wood finisher, and they worked hard. They sent me to Christian school from the time I was a child, and I came to know Jesus when I was 4 years old. And some people say, come on, you couldn't really have, but I went to gospel preaching churches, and they really preached the gospel and that you had to receive Jesus as your savior. And so I remember really clearly committing myself to him when I was 4, and then bugged my pastor like crazy to be baptized because he thought I was too young to be baptized. And he finally gave in when I was 5 and baptized me by immersion. And there wasn't like a gown small enough for me, so I just wore a dress and got it all wet. And anyway, so then, I was raised in that atmosphere where, you were memorizing huge quantities of scripture and so forth in all of the programs and so forth in the 1960s, 1970s, and went to Bible college when I was just 16. And then Tim and I got married when I was 20. And eventually I went to graduate school in English when he was also taking his doctorate at the same time in philosophy. So that's just a little bit of a background there.
Excellent. So you have a rather unusual path to doing Christian apologetics semi-professionally and doing New Testament scholarship publishing on New Testament issues, because you have your PhD in English, and then you published on primarily philosophical topics for several years. So can you tell us how your interest in apologetics specifically came about?
Yeah, I would say that, of course, it was definitely sparked by my husband. He's a professional philosopher. He's been chairman of his department. He's a full professor at Western Michigan University and works in epistemology, and we had written together. We got drawn into professionally putting together our work in epistemology, by the way, it's the theory of knowledge. In the theory of knowledge, putting that together with various approaches to apologetics back as far back as 2008, 2009, when we were tapped by Dr. William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland to write an article on the resurrection of Jesus. We had recently done some work opposing Alvin Plantinga's approach to the philosophy of religion, because even though he is a Christian, he was against taking an evidential approach. And so we had answered some of his technical work with our own technical expertise, because by this time, Tim and I were already publishing together in the theory of knowledge. So that kind of got us interested there. And then Tim began to do work in historical apologetics. He got a Templeton grant and did some work on the history of these controversies going back to the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And he got very interested in this issue of the undesigned coincidences, which we'll be discussing today. And he introduced that to me. I had to go on a train journey in 2014 on the Amtrak, and he went out and printed for me a book by William Paley, which was in public domain, and he spiral bound it, gave it to me to read on the train. And I just became very interested. And so he and I agreed that whoever got the time first to write a book bringing that undesigned coincidence argument into the 21st century would do it. And then, because he's got a day job, I happen to have the time first. So all this time, though, I've still been publishing in analytic philosophy and probability. So I'm like doing those on parallel tracks with issues in testimony and independence and all kinds of things that are obviously going to be relevant to the evaluation of the Gospels, but I do it in a secular form, in just a pure epistemology way. But then in my New Testament work, I apply it. And then I've just gotten drawn, more and more into write and spend more and more time doing things that I think are important, correcting what I consider to be unfortunate trends in the field of New Testament scholarship. So now I'm working on my third book in New Testament.
Excellent. So this summer you started a YouTube channel. The link to that is down below, and Chloe has already subscribed. I encourage everyone to do that. I've checked out the content myself. It's very excellent content. Definitely deserves more subscribers. So can you tell us what your aim with the YouTube channel is and what your goals for the channel are?
The motto I've chosen for the channel is making common sense rigorous. So I kind of view that as my value proposition that I'm offering to my subscribers, that I'm taking what I think are really very commonsensical ideas about the reliability of the gospel. So I'm chiefly working in New Testament there, and bringing that together with philosophy. And so the idea is that we take people's initial idea, hey, these books look like they're historical and so forth, and then we say, well, can we make a rigorous argument for that? Can we do that without just being credulous, just saying, oh yes, I believe this because it's the Bible, and not having an argument for it, but rather give them an argument that can make that common sense intuition rigorous. And so I'm hoping, I don't have like a vision what I'm going to be doing a year from now on the YouTube channel, but I'm just hoping gradually to add more and more topics on. Right now I'm doing, for example, a series with sub-series on miracles and miracle reports in the Gospels and how we can evaluate that and how that intersects with gospel reliability. My next sub-series in that will hopefully be on the infancy of Jesus and the virgin birth in time for Christmas.
Excellent. We have a comment here from Slam RN. It says, I love Tim and Lydia McGrew. They are warriors for the kingdom. And I agree with that completely. Tim is one of my favorite apologists of all time. I first came introduced to the subject primarily through William Lane Craig. Everyone loves William Lane Craig. But I would put Timothy McGrew right up there on the same level. And I love Lydia as well. She's relatively new to making large amounts of video content. She only had a few presentations to churches that I've seen from years past, whereas I saw lots of Tim's videos that he did in presentations to churches and whatnot on YouTube. But I'd say they both are excellent, and I definitely agree with that statement 100%. So let's take some general questions first before we get into the subject matter. A lot of Christian apologists advocate for what's called a minimal facts case, where they say they go with just the most important things from their perspective. They they take these 3 or 4 points and they use those and they try to establish the truth of the resurrection. They say, even if the Gospels aren't generally reliable, we can establish these certain things as true based on ordinary historical methods. That's not to say that they don't believe that the Gospels are reliable, but they don't make that assumption that they're reliable. But you advocate for what could be called a maximal facts approach. Can you explain why you think this approach is superior?
Yeah, I think it's important because I think people who do the minimal facts, or Dr. Bill Craig calls them core facts. He doesn't think of his approach as minimal facts, but I think it shares something in common. He calls them core facts. And I think people who take that approach, especially at the popular level, and who borrow that and use it really widely, don't realize just how minimal these are. And these minimal or core facts approaches involve a heavy reliance on what is granted by the majority of scholars, as said, across the ideological spectrum. So these could be unbelievers, believers, skeptics, atheists, liberals, conservatives, whatever. And the idea is that we're trying to find these core facts that are granted by them. Well, when we get to the appearances of Jesus to his disciples, what I think people don't understand is that, and I think the scholars, unfortunately, who advocate the approach haven't always been as consistent on this, is that these are very minimal appearance claims. So, for example, if you ask Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, and I actually did ask him this in the comments on his subscriber blog, does he really grant group appearances? And if he thinks there were group appearances of Jesus to his disciples, what does he think they were like? And he said, no, he doesn't really grant that there were group appearances. But then if there were, he thinks they were sort of like what he thinks Marian appearances were like in the he said, seeing at a distance, vision at a distance. So if we have to water down the appearances to such an extent that we're kind of including just some kind of experience or other, then I don't believe that we have a strong enough argument for the resurrection. I mean, I'm just going to be really blunt with that. And I think a lot of times when people, they go right up a minimal facts, essay or document or blog post, or they go do it in public, they say, did you know that a majority of scholars grant that the disciples had appearance experiences? And it's like, well, did you know that could mean just like vaguely seeing him at a distance? So they think it means like what we have in the Gospels, where they're meeting with him and they can touch him and he's appearing to a skeptic like doubting Thomas, and that's not granted by a majority of scholars. So what I would say is to have a strong argument. And after all, we're asking people to be willing to die for Jesus. These are people all over the world are going to come to Jesus. They don't necessarily have the luxury of sitting in their home and just thinking about this. We're asking them to go out there and commit their lives to Jesus on the basis of a miracle. I think we need a really strong argument. And to have that strong of an argument, I think what we need to do is to say that they testified as recorded in the Gospels. And that's how Tim's in my 2009 article actually goes. It's not a minimal facts argument. Let's say that we actually have the testimony according to what we find in the Gospels. And where he sat down and ate, for example. Okay, so Bart Ehrman doesn't think that the witnesses testified that he sat down and ate. He thinks that was made up, that somebody like way later added that as an embellishment. So I think that to make a good argument, we have to say that was not added as an embellishment. The disciples really said, just like 40 days later on the day of Pentecost, we sat and we ate with him and had long conversations. And then we have to say, what's the best explanation of that? And I think then you can get a really strong resurrection argument that it's very hard. Either they were lying, and it's extremely hard to explain why they would lie under those circumstances, or they were making a mistake. But how could you make a mistake about a thing like that? Or they were telling the truth. So that's how I present that maximal facts kind of approach.
Yeah, when I was first doing apologetics, I found personally, I found the minimal facts type case, Craig's case isn't technically a minimal facts, but, I grew up on Craig's material, and, I found that very persuasive. But over time, I've become much more inclined to go with this maximal facts approach. I think you lose a lot when you don't try to make any attempt to establish that the Gospels are reliable. I think to the average non-believing person that if you're telling them these core facts are true, even if the account is generally untrue, well, they'll say, well, big deal. If the account's generally untrue, I don't want to follow the person described in there. Mm-hmm. If this was actually from God, I would think it would all be reliable and not just these core facts. And of course, as I said, the advocates of this don't say that the other material is unreliable, but I think they're losing a lot by throwing it out. And we did have a couple comments pointing out the value of the eating, Jesus eating with the disciples and the appearances. So you're right on with that, because as you said, that's one of the things you might lose if you go with this minimal facts approach. So in your introduction to the mirror or the mask, which we'll be discussing in detail today, you talk about what you call credentialism, that critics have attempted to reject your work wholesale because they because you supposedly don't have the right expertise, you don't have a degree in New Testament scholarship or whatever. I think that this isn't really just a problem with Christian apologetics or New Testament scholarship. This is a kind of a problem throughout academia, that people, when they try to write outside their area with their degree, everyone just kind of dismisses their work and says, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, rather than addressing the arguments. This is, of course, a logical fallacy. Either you could see it as a genetic fallacy or appeal to authority, either way you want to go. But, dismissing the arguments based on the person making them. So how do you think people like me or my audience, who are, carefully thinking people, but we're not experts, we don't have degrees in New Testament scholarship either. So how can we avoid this trap and evaluate ideas honestly? And, how can we also avoid the opposite trap where we just automatically believe whatever we like best?
Sure, and that is tough because there are only so many hours in a day, right? How much time do you have, to investigate everything? So I think you have to choose what you're going to look into. And one point that I often make about credentialism is that you have credentialed scholars on different sides of the issue, so then it becomes arbitrary. Peter J. Williams, for example, is principal of Tyndale House in England and endorsed the Mirror of the Mask. He's a extremely well-credentialed New Testament scholar. So, what are you going to do? Go eeny, meeny, miny, mo, between him and someone who accepts, the views that I'm disagreeing with, then which one are you going to pick? So I think that what the layman has to do is a certain amount of self-investigation and then decide how to spend his time. I mean, for example, if you hear about these literary device views and you kind of say, that just doesn't make a lot of sense, and you can kind of see right away that it doesn't make sense, you don't necessarily have to delve into it in a lot of detail. But if someone says, well, gee, I don't know, that they're claiming that this is what we find in the exercise books of the time or something, okay, then thank God we have the internet in a way that you can do your research more efficiently. And then I've tried to put out, enough information to research it. So, you don't reinvent the wheel, but you also try to use the resources at your disposal to kind of do a targeted investigation of these things. And this is one reason why I've put my own work out in multiple formats. So I've got my book, The Mirror or the Mask, if you want like the full treatment, but also on my YouTube channel. Part of the reason I started it in the summer specifically was because Dr. Michael Licona, with whom I interact a lot in The Mirror or the Mask, he did a response series to me. And so then I did a response series to him. So if you like YouTube videos, you can do it. You can look on there. But then also I've tried to enable, captioning. YouTube doesn't always do it, but they usually do it. If you want to open the transcript, you can read the transcript. I've got a series of blog posts if you prefer blog posts, or you could just listen to the audio or whatever. So I've tried to do this in so many different ways so that people can get the content in the way that is most efficient for them. And then maybe they can also zero in, okay, that was the video I wanted to listen to because that was the argument that seemed to me like it was maybe persuasive. Let's see what she has to say about that. And so I guess that's what I would say. Try to use your time as efficiently as you can, but then also try to think for yourself and hear some arguments on both sides.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that there's nothing wrong with listening to arguments from all sides. I think that's exactly what we should do. I believe that we have truth on our side as Christians, that the Christian faith is true. And so, I don't have a problem with people investigating other material. I do a lot of work on Islamic outreach, and in Muslim societies, there's a strong bias to not search out material that's different than you. That if it doesn't come from a respected Muslim authority, it's just automatically dismissed, and that's not how to find truth. You got to look at all the arguments, evaluate them as best you can, and at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to come to a conclusion. No one can do that for you, so you have to put in the time. We have a super sticker from Chloe. Thank you very much for that. So your first book was called Hidden in Plain View, which was published in 2017. It's on the subject of undesigned coincidences, as you alluded to. Today we're going to focus primarily on the mirror of the mask, but I think it's briefly helpful to touch on the subject of undesigned coincidences first, because it has a direct bearing on the question we're trying to answer. Are the Gospels reliable eyewitness reports of history? So what is an undesigned coincidence?
I refer to an undesigned coincidence as an incidental interlocking that points to truth. And I wish I'd thought of that before I wrote Hidden in Plain View. I didn't think of it until I was doing talks afterwards, but it's like a puzzle fitting between puzzle pieces of facts about an account. So I can give like a really quick modern type of example. If you have two different people who witness a robbery, and then the police are interrogating them, asking them questions later, and one of them says he tripped on the way out. And then they're talking to the other witness, and the other witness doesn't appear to be trying to address what that guy said. They might even be in different rooms. And the other witness said, and I looked when he walked up to the window and I noticed that his shoelace was untied. That's an undesigned coincidence, that his shoelace was untied, and then the other guy says he tripped when he went out. And because they're coming from different people, and yet those two facts seem to fit together.
Excellent. We did have a comment going back to credentialism, which I thought was excellent. What PhD or degree did Jesus have? He was a carpenter. The disciples were fishermen, shepherds, etc. And, that's a great point. We're following Jesus here, and then we're saying, well, you only have casual knowledge of this subject. We can't listen to you. You got to get a degree first. It's kind of ridiculous when you put it that way. And then we had a super chat from Slam RN. Thanks for having Dr. Lydia McGrew on, and you are very welcome for that. And thank you for the super chat. So can you walk us through an example of a non-designed coincidence in the Gospels?
Sure. So we've got lots of them. Get a hold of Hidden in Plain View by all means. And the Mirror of the Mask has more undesigned coincidences. And the book I'm working on and hope to come out in the spring is going to be called The Eye of the Beholder. That's just about the Gospel of John, and that has undesigned coincidences in it as well. So here's just one. When Jesus is about to feed the 5,000, the way that John tells the story is that he sees the multitude and it's getting to be evening, and he turns to Philip and he says, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Why did he ask Philip specifically that question? Now, it could just be random. People do, maybe he just happened to be standing there. But if it was made up, I don't think you'd really especially expect John to make up the story and insert Philip. It's not like he's the least prominent disciple, but he's certainly not the most prominent disciple. And there's nothing, he's not like Judas, who is the treasurer, who would have the money to buy stuff or whatever. And of course, Jesus isn't really going to have them buy the bread anyway, but he's kind of teasing them a little bit. So why Philip? So you look around elsewhere in John and you find a couple mentions very casually, apropos of other completely separate stories, that Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, so what? But then you go over to the Gospel of Luke, and only in Luke, in his story of the feeding of the 5,000, he says that it took place near Bethsaida. And so now we can put this all together, and the idea is that when Jesus is going to ask them, where should we buy bread, he turns to someone who's local from that area, and he says, hey, Philip, where can we buy bread around here that these may eat? And I think that's a reasonable explanation, and it fits together these three different passages, two of them apparently unrelated in John, that only then makes sense when you bring in the third passage from Luke about Bethsaida. So that's just one of many examples.
Excellent. It was kind of Timothy who rediscovered these. I say rediscovered because apparently they were well known in the 19th century, but I had never heard of them before, and I imagine most Christians had never heard of them before Tim started talking about them. And it's
J. Warner Wallace does it too.
Yeah, it's really a great, and a lot of people talk about them now, but I mean, it's really a great piece of evidence that if these are eyewitness testimonies or based on eyewitness testimonies, this is exactly what you might think you'd find, that you'd find details that are different but are compatible, that they work together and they unlock more of the story. If they were fabrications, you would either just find everyone saying the same exact thing, or you'd find contradictory information, actually contradictory information. We might get a chance to look at a couple alleged contradictions, because that's kind of what these supposed literary devices are meant to solve. But when you really look at the Gospels, what you really find is that they have the marks of being eyewitness testimony. They certainly don't have the marks of people getting together and having this conspiracy to all tell the same story, and they don't really look like people just making up random things either. We did have a comment from a boss who I assume is a Muslim. How can you claim that Gospels are reliable when you have fabrications like the longer ending of Mark and the woman caught in adultery in John? And then he also says that they contradict like the genealogies being an especially poor example, because that one's very easy. We have a wide variety of reasons to solve that one. But, just the general comment here that we do see these additions in some manuscripts. How can we be sure that the rest isn't? Well, the first thing I would say is, stay tuned. You have to look at all the evidence. You can't just look at one piece of evidence and form your conclusion based on that. The other thing I would say is the fact that we know these things are additions shows that we have the original to compare them to. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think you make a good point about, there aren't actually a lot of places that appear to be not part of an earlier manuscript. I mean, that's why we've noticed the pericopai adulteri that he's referring to in the long ending of Mark. They're actually unusual, but not only that, I'm not sure that they're fabrications anyway. We need to distinguish between a textual addition and something that didn't happen. It's interesting to see, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the pericopai adulteri, that's the story about the woman caught in adultery, occurs in Tatian's Diatessaron in the 2nd century. So that's pretty striking. And there are some manuscripts that insert it, believe it or not, into Luke, into the Gospel of Luke. It looks to me like something that happened, but that just wasn't part of the original manuscript of Mark. So, excuse me, I misspoke, of John. So John was may have been telling it as a story, and then somebody else wrote it down, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. In fact, it fits extremely well with what else we know about the character of Jesus. And the long ending of Mark, most of that is just a summary of what we find elsewhere in the other Gospels. So that looks like what somebody added because probably the original ending of Mark was lost. And as you say, I don't think there's a difficulty with the genealogies. I think one is the genealogy of Joseph and the other is the genealogy of Mary. And because Joseph would have been his, father-in-law's legal son and that kind of thing. So yeah, there are all kinds of challenges that people are going to bring up. But the interesting thing I find when you learn the evidence for Christianity is that you get, I call it a sense of the landscape. And that sense of the landscape causes you to respond differently to those alleged contradictions or alleged problems. I often tell people this is not a whack-a-mole game. So this isn't a game where, it's like problem, whack, problem, whack, and I get people writing to me, oh no, what do I do about this? And I say, this is not a whack-a-mole game. Calm down, go and get a sense of that landscape of the evidence, and then don't get all shook up every time something comes along. That's called the fallacy of objections, where you think that any new objection is like the end of your faith, and that's not really how it works.
Yeah, I would have the same view on the story of the woman caught in adultery, that it's a true story. It could even be something that John told or John wrote in a different context, and it got incorporated into the gospel. I think precisely because we also see it incorporated into Luke in at least a couple manuscripts, that people knew this was a true story. They were just trying to find a place to put it. And, adding it to the Gospel of John instead of having it as a separate book of the Bible, I mean, that doesn't really affect the reliability of it in any way. And of course, this is the exception. We see that well over 99% of the New Testament text is beyond question. Even very skeptical scholars agree with that statement. So we don't see the massive kind of corruption that, say, a Muslim would claim. But Trinity Matrix pointed out that the Bible doesn't actually claim to be free of contradictions or inconsistencies, unlike the Quran. And that's because we have a different view of inspiration, that we believe that the Bible was written by human beings under the inspiration of God. We don't believe it to be the literal speech of God. And I'll point out that today, everything we're arguing for doesn't assume inerrancy. It doesn't assume that the Gospels are true. It doesn't assume they're from God. We're arguing based on how you would look at any history. You would look at a source, you'd evaluate its trustworthiness based on what you could determine. And that doesn't mean you can verify every fact. There's not one work of ancient history that you can verify every fact from. But if what you can verify is generally true, then you can believe the rest to be true. And that's exactly how secular history is done. Anything you'd like to add?
No, that sounds good.
All right. So we can now dive into the main subject. A little less than a year ago, you released your second book, which is called The Mirror, the Mask. Can you briefly explain the thesis of that book and your reasons for writing it? And I'll point out there is a link to the Amazon page as well as the Barnes & Noble page if you'd like to get a copy of that. It's available both in print and in Kindle format.
Yep. Yeah, I wrote The Mirror or the Mask to argue that the Gospels are what I call reportage. And my idea there is that the authors are always trying to get it right. They're never deliberately changing any fact, and they're very successful at doing so. As you just said, I'm not arguing for inerrancy, though what I argue is compatible with inerrancy. If someone is an inerrantist, he can use all of my arguments. I don't use that as a premise, and I don't argue that that's like has to be the case. But I am arguing that they're highly successful and that they're never deliberately changing the facts. I was motivated to do this because I came to realize that within the evangelical world, and that was what surprised me. I expected it more in the sort of what we would call mainstream New Testament scholarship, but I saw it coming more into the evangelical scholarship. These views were becoming more and more widely accepted, that the gospel authors deliberately changed some things and invisibly changed them as well. And people I saw, especially in the apologetics community, there's this whole sort of apologetics community. They're laymen in some ways, or they might be pastors. They might be getting seminary degrees, but they're not full-time Christian workers all the time, unless they're pastors, but they're not full-time scholars. But they're really interested in technical issues in apologetics, various arguments for Christianity, and it's this interesting kind of a bridge community. And within that sort of bridge community, what we were getting was more and more acceptance of this idea that the gospel authors sometimes change the facts. And you'd get variations. Some people would say, oh, it was only, once or twice. And then some people would start by saying it was only once or twice. And then whatever their leader said, they'd say, oh, yeah, he did it that time too. And he did it that time too. And by the way, most of the contradictions can be explained this way. Well, that's a lot of times. That ends up being a lot of changes. So I saw this growing in popularity, and I began to research it. I wrote a bunch of lengthy blog posts, scholarly blog posts, between 2017 and 2019 on these issues. Well, especially 2017 to 2018. And I thought at first that was the venue where I was going to do it. And I thought we'll just leave it there. But I realized it just wasn't getting the publicity that it needed, and also that there was a lot more to go into. And also there were some objections to the effect that this can't be taken seriously if you just do it as blog posts. So I approached my publisher, who had published Hidden in Plain View, and talked to him about it. And what I ended up doing was writing a book that has a positive as well as a negative aspect to it. It goes into a lot of detail refuting the background to these claims, but then it also has a lot of positive evidence as well, new positive evidence for the reliability of the Gospels that doesn't just overlap my existing book, Hidden in Plain View. And so it was fresh material. It's a long, meaty book, but it has chapter summaries, so you can kind of pick which chapters you want to read and delve into in more detail. But I thought that was necessary, and I feel that I've done there a definitive job, I would say a really thorough job, refuting at different levels these views about the gospel authors changing the facts, but then also bringing forward more positive evidence for this reportage model. And so I really hope that it'll be useful to the body of Christ. I think you've been muted.
Yes, I muted myself because I was typing and I forgot to unmute. So yeah, one thing I'd say about the book is that it has a lot of references to primary sources, and it has the source text right there in it. There's several appendices with just tons of information. So you can go and you can look at the data for yourself, and you can draw your own conclusions, which I think is great. You're not just being told what to believe. The data's there for you to examine for yourself. We did have a comment from Mojo Dude that says consistency outweighs minor discrepancies by far. And, that's what I was saying earlier, that, and this is the benefit of, taking this so-called maximal facts approach, that we can look at all the evidence. Yes, it may take a little more time. It doesn't take like ages and ages to explain our case. But we can look at lots of data, and we can see whether there's a pattern of reliability or there's a pattern of unreliability, and then we can judge what we're unsure about. And say the discrepancy. Let's say we can't think of a harmonization for a particular discrepancy. Well, we got to weigh that. If we see that 95% of the material is very reliable and it's very historically accurate, and then we see, 5% we can't explain, well, we can say that 5% isn't a big deal because there's probably an explanation and we just don't know what it is.
Yeah, and I would also say, as far as the amount of time that the case takes, any case you do, whether it be a minimal facts or maximal facts, you have your elevator version, And then you have your background stuff that you can bring out if needed. It's sometimes said that you keep the pots and pans in the kitchen. So you have your pots and pans in the kitchen, all of your background, research. Then you see in your conversation you're having or your debate or whatever, what it is that the person brings out, and you're prepared to bring that out and discuss it in more detail. So just like anything else, I can give you an elevator version of a Maximal data argument for Christianity, but then I've got all my other stuff that I'm ready to go with if need be, and I'm prepared to answer. And I definitely agree about the contradictions. If there's stuff that you don't know how to solve, I've thought that people need to be more willing to just say, I don't know what the answer to that is. But that would be true of a scientific theory as well, that there would be things that I wouldn't know the answer to. And I wonder to what extent the apologetics emphasis upon live debate has made it harder for people to do that, because they feel maybe that would be a sign of weakness to not always. So you've always got to have something to say. You got to have something to say, And so even if you just gesture in the direction, well, I'm sure that was a literary device, it makes you feel like you have something to say. Whereas the older, even inerrantists, would be a lot more willing to say, yeah, maybe it was this, or maybe it was this, or maybe it was this, or maybe it was something else we don't know, and just leave it at that. And I think that's a healthier epistemological approach.
Excellent. So the subtitle of Mirror Mask is Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. That said, I'm sure you're not claiming that the gospel authors didn't use literary devices. For example, hyperbole is a literary device. There's cases of clear hyperbole in the text. But rather, you're writing against what you call fictionalizing literary devices. Can you explain the difference between these two?
Yeah, so you gave a good example there. Jesus says something about a camel going through the eye of a needle, and he's not really saying that a camel can go through the eye of a needle. Or he says, if your hand offends you, cut it off. He's not saying you should literally cut off your hand and that kind of thing. And another example would be that the gospel authors sometimes arrange their material topically. So you'll find a chapter of Luke, and he'll just say, and he said, and he said, and he said, and it's a bunch of stuff about prayer, for example. So that would be, I would think of like a heap. He has a heap of sayings of prayer, about prayer that Jesus made, but he doesn't necessarily know when he said them. Well, he doesn't claim that he knows when he said them. He just kind of arranges them that way topically. So you could think of that as a kind of literary device, though it's not a highly sophisticated one. And we do some of these things in our daily speech. But when I talk about fictionalizing or fact-changing devices, they have three characteristics. One is that what's narrated is contrary to fact, and the second is that it appears to be realistic, and the author knows that it's contrary to fact, but he's narrating it in a way that isn't tagged. So it's not like a parable where Jesus says a certain man had two sons. Well, right away, that's like our saying once upon a time. That's a tag. It's not tagged like that. It just kind of seamlessly weaves right into the narrative. So if you read it, even if the original audience read it, they wouldn't be able to tell it wasn't real. And then thirdly, it's deliberate. So the author didn't just make an ordinary mistake. The author actually knew, well, this happened at a different time, but I'm going to make it happen at this time in my story. An analogy that Dr. Michael Licona himself uses, he advocates these, and was his analogy, was a movie based on true events. And we have these in our own time, that they might move something around to a different time, or have something happen at a time when it didn't happen, or create a dialogue to make it more interesting, that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing he's talking about, because if you want to know if that really happened the way it does in the movie, you have to go Google it. Right? You can't just tell by watching the movie. The movie looks realistic. But there's no Google, of course, back then, and the Gospels are supposedly the primary sources. So that's kind of a difference. I don't think people realize that we're talking about things where even the original audience was not going to be able to pick and choose and say, oh, well, he threw a little word in there that shows me that he didn't mean me to take that literally. There's not a word like that in there. And so that's kind of the difference between a literary thing like telling a parable or something that's non-fact changing and one that is fact changing.
Excellent. To make this a little more concrete, could you give an example of what someone might claim is a literary device in the Gospels?
Sure, and there's a lot of them. So I'll just give one example right now. One that's very popular, and I did a whole series on it on my YouTube channel, is the temple cleansing. So in John 2, Jesus cleanses the temple early in his ministry, and I think it's accurate to say that John is narrating Jesus doing this early. I think he has a lot of indicators that it's early. And then you go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they have a story of Jesus cleansing the temple, and it's, going in and casting out the money changers and all of that, driving out those who sell doves and rebuking them. And they have a story of him doing this at the end of his ministry. It would be at least 3 years later, around Passover, shortly before his death. So an example of a alleged compositional device or literary device would be the claim that John knew that it didn't happen early in the ministry. He knew that it happened only once late in the ministry, and then he moved it so that he has Jesus cleansing the temple early in the ministry instead, and he maybe had some heavy theological symbolism. For example, scholar Craig Keener says that the symbolism was to make Jesus' whole ministry seem like Passion, like Jesus' whole ministry was symbolically within Passion Week. So that's his idea. Other people have other symbolism that they think, it's very hard to tell because you're supposedly reading John's mind at that point. It's this sort of secret symbolism he's trying to put in there, but that's an example of a alleged compositional device that I'm talking about, where it's narrated very realistically. And the idea is that the original audience just wouldn't have minded. It's not that they could tell, maybe they'd guess. Sometimes a scholar will say, well, they knew that it was this way in Mark. And then there's just this notion that they just preferred Mark historically. No argument is ever given for this. Why they would have preferred Mark historically to John, I don't see why, because Mark wasn't even an apostle of Jesus, and John, they believed, was. So why would they have thought Mark was the historical one and then John was made up? But as far as what's actually there, they would just be guessing, just like modern scholars are guessing. But then the claim is they were like, we would be with a movie. We'd be like, well, it doesn't really matter. It's just a movie. And that they wouldn't care. And that's the sense in which it's supposed to be a device of the time or accepted at the time. And these scholars do not believe that it happened twice. I think it happened twice. I think Jesus went in and did it twice. I think that's the obvious answer. St. Augustine said that. He said it was evident that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. And it's not a big problem. I've engaged in protests in front of abortion clinics twice. So, same clinic, right? It's, of course, people do the same type of symbolic act on more than one occasion, the same kind of social protest on more than one occasion, but they don't think so. So there's an example for you.
Excellent. And we'll probably get to some more examples of this and how there are better solutions. Of course, this one easy, better solution is that Jesus did it twice. Mm-hmm. But, other cases, it might not be so obvious. But I think the real problem isn't so much that, someone suggests, well, this was moved, but rather that it's just totally arbitrary. Anyone can just look at the text and say, well, I think these two things are similar enough. They must actually be the same event. This especially happens with, say, the sayings of Jesus. Well, I mean, if he was a itinerant preacher, he probably said the same thing or the same basic thing many, many times. So to say it's ridiculous to say that he said, fairly different parables, but with the same theme on two different occasions, for example, I think that's pretty ridiculous.
I agree. Yeah, I strongly agree. And you do find that the idea of moving a saying, if somebody listened to different interviews of mine, they find me saying the same thing twice. I mean, what I just said right here, you could find almost word for word in another interview. So that's absolutely true. There is a kind of allergy in scholarship to thinking that Jesus did the same thing twice or said the same thing twice, and then they'll caricature it. They'll compare what we've just said here to like something really silly. Like if there's an apparent discrepancy about when Jesus cursed the fig tree, I've actually seen this. This is in a passage in Dr. Keener's book, Christobiography. He says, oh, well, did Jesus curse two different fig trees on one day, one right after the other, and have the same conversation about faith on, two subsequent days? And he does not have any footnote that anybody's ever suggested that. And it's kind of interesting to see these, that they sound completely ridiculous, and that you can't actually find anybody, even Gleason Archer, Norman Geisler, very sort of strong inerrantists don't suggest these. So they're a kind of a straw man, they're a kind of a caricature. Then that will be compared to saying that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. I remember I had an email exchange once with a New Testament scholar. I won't name him, but he got throwing a bunch of these at me. How often was Jesus rejected at Nazareth? And did Jesus cleanse? We discussed the temple cleansing, healing of a nobleman's son or servant. Is that two different events? And I forget on which one it was. When I said, yeah, I think something similar happened twice, he wrote back and said, how often are you going to do that? Now, I thought that was an interesting response, because the only response is as often as the evidence warrants. To me, that was a kind of bullying, to say to the person, how often are you going to do that? I'm like, why? Is there a limit? Is there a number? I'm not allowed to say that he did something similar on more than one occasion, more than 10 times or something. Are you counting? It was a very odd response, and I think it shows you one of the problems with the discipline.
Yeah, and of course, Bart Ehrman likes to say, well, if you're an inerrantist, you have to say that the crow crowed the crow made noise 9 times, or something ridiculous like that.
Exactly.
That literally no one would ever argue for. It's sad that they have to straw man the position like that. Mm-hmm. We've had a little bit of chatter in the chat already about whether this really matters, and that's what the first section of your book is dedicated to, explaining why this question matters. So your target is primarily conservative Christian scholars, people who agree with you on all the important salvific doctrines. They agree on the incarnation, they agree on the deity of Christ, his atoning death, and of course his bodily resurrection. So it's not necessarily a salvation issue, but aside from the importance of what is true itself, why does it matter if the New Testament authors say changed minor details or rearranged the order of events?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I'm going to have sort of a two-part answer. My first part, the answer is that some of these definitely concern more than just minor details, and so I can give examples of the fabrication of entire scenes, dialogues, things of apologetic importance, such as the appearance of Jesus to doubting Thomas, and these kinds of things that are being suggested as possible and even plausible things that the authors might have made up. So at that point, I think it becomes even more evident. Craig Evans has agreed with Bart Ehrman that Jesus didn't recognizably utter various I am sayings. He says that these were I am the true vine, I am the way, the truth, and the life. These were the creation of the Johannine community. So once you start seeing those, then I think it becomes evident, wait a minute, this isn't just some itty-bitty little trivial thing. So that's the first part of my answer. And then the second part of my answer is to ask you to envisage yourself as being on a jury, and a person is testifying about some events, and he says that it happened on a Saturday. And then under questioning, he's pressed and he is forced to admit, oh my goodness, yeah, I got that wrong. It actually occurred on a Wednesday. So now imagine that the witness says, yeah, I knew it happened on a Wednesday, but I changed it to a Saturday to make a better story. Are you on the jury going to trust the other things he has to say? Even though changing it from one day to the next, it's only 4 or 5 days, you might say, well, that doesn't seem like a very big deal, but it tells you something about the person. And at this point, what does he think makes a good story? It's very hard to tell what that person's going to think makes a good story. It makes a pretty big difference to the reliability of the Gospels. often these undesigned coincidences we've just talked about confirm details. And so we look to the Gospels, and this is true for external confirmations as well. They come in and they confirm, like the specific material that the water pots were made out of at the marriage at Cana, or the type of coin that Peter found in the fish's mouth, or these kinds of things. Very, very small details. Well, I don't think we as Christians can have it both ways. I don't think we can say, yippee, yay, this is confirmed by archaeology, this little name of this town or whatever, and then turn around and say, oh, well, they thought it was fine to make up details, and it's just minor details, so who cares? And I've done work on this in probability theory, that if you actually expect an author to be just all over the map on the details, then you don't have a right to be going out there and expecting to confirm the account by those details. So those are a couple of different parts to that answer about why this matters.
Excellent. So, on a personal level, we have this idea that we shouldn't judge the Gospels by modern standards of historical writing, that we should judge them by contemporary standards. And I think that basic claim is certainly true, which means that if we do see that this type of fictionalization might be considered good writing, that we wouldn't necessarily want to fault the evangelists for doing it. And other times, this might help answer some difficult questions. We've kind of alluded to this, that you can just brush aside any contradiction you want by saying, oh, that was a literary device. But then for the professional scholars, there's another type of appeal that probably subconsciously, but that it might make their work more acceptable to the more liberal scholars, liberal Christian scholars, even atheist scholars who think a large portion of the gospel is complete fiction. So saying, well, we agree that a few things are fictionalized, might help win better acceptance. So, what do you think about these kind of psychological factors? Do you think they're a major factor in why people, especially conservative Christians, have begun to embrace these sorts of supposed devices?
Yeah, well, as far as the last one, I do think that conservative scholars have internalized some of these things, and they don't think of them as liberal standards anymore. They just think of them as the standards. So I think the example I gave a couple of minutes ago about the scholar, this was a conservative Christian scholar, saying, how often are you going to do that, is a good example. I call these anti-standards. And anti-standards are things that are really terrible epistemologically and historically, but they become so ingrained in a discipline that you actually look down on anybody who doesn't follow them. So if somebody just says, well, maybe the reason that John said that was just because he remembered that, then you say, man, you are so naive. You're supposed to use phrases like, this tradition may go back to the historic Jesus, or something like that. So certain ways of talking, certain ways of thinking have become, in a sense, a kind of a passport or a passkey to being thought of as a sophisticated scholar and as somebody who really knows the discipline. And they're actually not good standards, but the scholars don't know that. They don't know that. They really have internalized them. So there's that. And as far as not wanting to judge them by standards that are outside of their own time, I think that's huge. And I think a lot of people have adopted this. Laymen have listened to the scholars, and the scholars have listened to one another in adopting this. And there are two confusions there. One of them is a confusion between a kind of a figure of speech idea, or something like rounding numbers. So if we knew that it was a standard of the time to round the numbers to the nearest 1,000 or something, maybe we would say, okay, so that's how they would report that number. It's accurate. It's rounded to the nearest 1,000. But of course, as you can see and we'll see with more examples, this isn't at all like rounding numbers. It's a very different kind of thing. Or a figure of speech, like if I say I've got a frog in my throat, nobody really thinks I have a frog in my throat. So that people think that that's what we're talking about. They don't realize that we're really talking about this sort of movie making type of approach. So that's the first confusion, is what kind of thing we're really talking about. And then it becomes attractive to say, well, we're just understanding them by the standards of the time. And then the second confusion, I think, arises from not realizing that even if this was the standard of the time, we still have to decide what to believe. So, if I really did believe that the Gospels were like biopics or movies based on true events, even if I did believe it was the standard of the time, I would have less reason to believe what they have to say. I mean, I could say, okay, so it's the standard of the time to make stuff up. Now, how do I know how much of this to take to be literal? So that's not doing something wrong or something anachronistic, because after all, I have to decide for myself what to believe really happened. And the very act of supposedly taking this into account is then going to lower my expectations for accuracy, just like it would for a movie. I mean, I don't use movies based on true events as my primary sources for history, so I guess that means I shouldn't use the Gospels as my primary sources for history either. And these get melted together, and then people will say, oh, don't listen to Lydia McGrew, she's not judging them by the standards of the time. And it's like, if I thought you were right about the standards of the time, I would have a much lower estimate of how much factual material I could get out of them, and that would be legitimate.
Yeah, definitely. Perhaps the most important aspect of your book is that you challenge whether these supposed standards even existed at all and whether the gospel writers would be introduced to them. We'll get to that shortly, but first I wanted to take this request from Slam RN. I assume that she has probably read your book because she asked you to describe the difference between achronology and dyschronology.
Yeah, and I can do that with the temple cleansing that we talked about a moment ago. So that's why I emphasized that John is pretty clear, that this is happening early in the ministry. So the way I describe it in the book, I just coined some words. If an author knows that something is not the way it happened, and he deliberately changes the way it happened, then that is what I call dyschronology. That's changing it within the world of his story. If, on the other hand, an author is just unclear and he doesn't intend, and this lies in the author's intention, he doesn't intend you to think that it happened at that time, then I call that achronology. So the example I gave of Luke giving a bunch of Jesus' sayings about prayer, but he doesn't say when it happened, that would be an example of achronology. Now, an author might deliberately imply a chronology, and that could be dyschronology as well. If he's like, yeah, I'm not going to come right out and say it, but I'm going to kind of imply that this happened at a different time. It's if the author intends to change the time, that's dyschronology. And if the author doesn't even intend to give you a time, then that's achronology. And then both of these are different from making a mistake. Okay, so just making an honest mistake in history or the Gospels or something, you're putting a chronology in there, but it happens to be wrong, but you didn't know that. That's neither of those. That's a third thing, which is just making a mistake. So I think those three are good to keep separate.
Excellent. So we've talked a little bit about why this matters, but of course what we really want to know is what is true. I mean, just because it might affect our view of Scripture doesn't make it untrue. So in the second section of your book, you kind of challenge these ideas. And the first thing you look at is whether the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. This is kind of pretty much a universal assumption in scholarship that they fit into this genre. Can you tell us about why you would challenge this and what the data say about whether they should be put in this genre or not?
Well, I remember the first thing I thought when I heard that proposition was, that sounds way too specific. I remember thinking, so, I mean, it's fine to say the Gospels are biographies. And, unfortunately, in a book like Biographies in Jesus or Christobiography, you'll find scholars, they'll just say biographies, and then you go read more and you find that they mean something a lot more specific than that. So just to say that it's a biography, it's this very broad thing. It's just the story of Jesus' life, right? But Greco-Roman bioi, it's supposed to be this specific type of thing. Plutarch's Lives would be an example of that. They call them lives, bioi, lives. And so we have questions about whether several of the gospel authors would even have read those Greco-Roman things and been influenced by them. Luke might have been, because he's got a higher level of Greek. He appears to have been a Gentile. He might have read them. But then we also have all of this baggage that comes in with the claim that they're Greco-Roman biographies. We have certain definitions that are being given by the scholars to the effect that if you're writing a Greco-Roman biography, you think you're licensed to change the facts. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, that's bringing a lot of baggage in there, because then it's like, well, the gospel authors were writing Greco-Roman biographies, so think they thought it was they were licensed to change the facts. And so right away we've got real questions with that. And in any event, the argument out there for them being in such a specific genre is definitely lacking. I think we find that the things, they sound so good, like statistics, the number of sentences that have Jesus as the subject. It's this high number of sentences. And it's like, well, if they're about Jesus, of course they would have the name Jesus as a subject, So when you really delve into them, you find that these are family resemblances that don't really provide a strong case for anything that narrow and that specific.
Yeah, definitely. I think that perhaps the question of genre is really moot, because when you looked at the biographies, you found that there was quite a wide variety, that some were not regarded by historians as being very accurate at all, and others are seen as being highly accurate. And then furthermore, there's no evidence that the ancients had this idea that you could just go about and fabricate whatever you wanted when you're writing history. Can you give us an example of what the primary sources say about how to write history?
Yeah, there's a ton of that stuff in the book. And so one of the things I do, for example, is to investigate the claims of places where a non-biblical ancient author supposedly changed a fact. And I find that there's some of the same issues there with harmonization and jumping to conclusions. And it's like, no, he might have just made a mistake. He doesn't necessarily have to be doing this heavy literary thing. But also you find people like Lucian. He wrote a thing called How to Write History, and he's like really strong and really strict about truth. You find all of these statements about truth in the ancient authors. Now, sometimes those who are on the other side of this will say, well, they didn't always really follow that. Well, maybe you haven't heard the phrase that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And, in other words, if we found someone nowadays, some politician telling a lie, we wouldn't say, well, we have a literary device at our time where you're allowed to tell lies and nobody judges you for that. And we just, we might be cynical. We might expect politicians to tell lies because we're cynical. But there's a difference between being cynical and having a literary device where you don't really consider it to be a lie or whatever. So when you find all of these statements about being truthful and so forth, it doesn't really matter if you then find, for example, Josephus does some propaganda about his own earlier life. Well, yeah, that's propaganda. It's people are meant to believe it. Do we want to think that the Gospels are writing propaganda? So there's this kind of odd mixture in the approach that the Christian literary device theorists take. On the one hand, they become very offended if you imply that there's anything deceptive about this. They'll say, no, it's not deception. That was allowed by the standard at the time. And then on the other hand, they'll use examples that are actually examples of propaganda. And they'll say, then this shows that this was accepted. And it's like, well, no, if it were expected that people would change it, then it wouldn't work as propaganda. I mean, Josephus presumably wanted the people to believe his sort of whitewashing of his past. That's how he was hoping to get himself out of trouble. So I think there's a lot of confusion and a need to sort of sort these things out. But we definitely find that it's not by any means a modern thing to talk about the importance of literal truth. We find that talked about by a number of ancient authors.
Excellent. And then, of course, the people who are advocating for this quote these so-called textbooks. And, I found that when you actually looked at them, it was quite humorous, because what the authors of these textbooks were really doing was like teaching grammar, basically. They weren't teaching how to write history at all. Would you agree with that summary?
Well, they want people to use it to write history just the same way that if I were teaching writing, I would say they're teaching writing. If I were, and rhetoric and writing, speech making, they had professional speech writers back then. That was like a career you could aim for, speech making to be lawyers, all that kind of thing. And they're teaching that stuff. And yeah, you can use it as a historian. So something that Dr. Lacona will often point to is a passage where the author of one of these textbooks, a guy named Theon, says, this is useful for this, and he includes history. And it's like, yeah, it's useful for history, but the exercises are just exercises. And so they're just writing exercises. And so one of my favorite examples here, it's from one of the very passages that Dr. Lacona will use to argue that they were teaching these boys in school to change history. Theon has an exercise where he says you can negate the whole passage. So he has a passage about some battle, and he says you can go all the way through and go, this did not happen, and this did not happen, this did not happen. Well, now, obviously, that's not about teaching them that it's okay to change history and say that everything that did happen did not happen. He's teaching them to use negation. So these kind of examples really refute the use of the textbooks that Dr. Lacona and others want to make.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But what about the Gospels? Do they have any direct evidence within themselves or in the writings of the church fathers that the gospel writers thought it was acceptable to, say, invent speeches of Jesus or change details?
Yeah, there's tons of evidence, both internal and external, implicit and explicit, on this matter. So, for example, a bit of external evidence is from the church father Papias. He talks about wanting to talk to people who had known Jesus. He's very specific. And he says, I didn't want to hear, this is a paraphrase from memory, but that I didn't want to hear the memories of the commandments of men, but I wanted to hear the memories of the commandments proceeding from the truth itself, by which he meant Jesus, because Jesus said, I am the truth. And so he said, I didn't think that learning from books was as good as the living and surviving voice. So he was living in an era where he could actually talk to people who had known Jesus, and certainly also people who had known the apostles. And so what he was trying to do was to get back, as close as he could to hear what the historical Jesus said. So this definitely shows a distinction between even apostolic teaching, which they would maybe extrapolate from what Jesus taught, or they would apply what Jesus taught, and Jesus' historical teaching. That Papias really wanted to hear that living and surviving voice of the commandments proceeding from the truth itself. So that's an external example. Internal examples, of course, we find John saying, he who has seen it bore record and his record is true. So we find these explicit statements. We find Luke saying, I've investigated all these things from the very beginning, Theophilus, so that you may be assured of the truth of what you've been taught. So, they're being pretty clear. Peter says, we have not followed cunningly devised fables. Peter and John, speaking to the Jewish leaders, say we must testify to what we have heard and seen. So there's this very empirical emphasis, which shows that that's not it's not anachronistic at all. So, but then there are also these wonderful little indirect indications as well, and I love those too. I was indexing my book on John this morning. I absolutely hate indexing, and the only fun part of it is that I'll run across a part of the book that I had maybe forgotten, and I can say, oh yeah, I remember that. So here was one where Jesus in John 6 is speaking, and he says, I have told you before that you have seen me, and yet you have not believed on me. Now, the cool thing about this is that we have no record of this other saying when he told them before. It's not in John. We have no idea what he's alluding to. So there's this idea in scholarship that the gospel authors felt free to put sayings in Jesus' mouth and speeches in Jesus' mouth. And if John was going to do that, why wouldn't he have bothered to go invent a saying where he told them before that they have seen them and not believed on him? Why would you put that in there as a loose end? And there's a bunch of these. So that's just another indicator of that kind of scrupulousness, or the fact that John will pause and he'll say, this is what Jesus meant by this. They call those Johannine asides, where he'll speak to the reader as the narrator. If he thought he was free to just put his own ideas into Jesus' mouth, why would he bother to make that distinction? So that shows that is not just a modern distinction, that is an ancient distinction.
Excellent. Veronica pointed out that truth was very important to Jesus. Why would his witnesses think they can tell things like they want? And, that's a good point, that they would be far more influenced by the teaching of Jesus than the supposed literary standards of the Roman world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You do find some really strange eisegesis of Jesus' own words. Eisegesis, of course, as your hearers probably know, and as you know, it's like reading our own meanings into the text. So, for example, there's a verse in Matthew, I believe it's 13, where Jesus says, every scribe instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like a man who brings out of his treasury things both old and new. And it's just one of these little proverb type things that Jesus says, and all kinds of interpretations of what he meant. Dr. Craig Evans, who's one of these literary device theorists, he interprets that as meaning that Jesus was literally teaching his disciples to put their interpretations into his mouth in reporting his words, and that showed that they were scribes instructed in the kingdom. He says that this is what he was instructing them to do. I had a debate in 2018 with Dr. Evans, and he said that. He said, doesn't Lydia believe that this is what they were instructed to do? And he cited this verse, and I'm like, that's not what that verse, I mean, there's no reason to think that verse means that at all. So we do find that, or often scholars will cite Jesus' references to the Comforter, the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit coming and teaching them. And they'll say, see, they were guided by the Holy Spirit. So they thought that it was okay for them to do this because their words were also inspired by the Spirit. Well, that's also eisegesis, because Jesus says he will bring to your remembrance what I have said to you, and he will teach you all things, and he will show you things to come. So he's distinguishing different activities of the Holy Spirit, helping them to remember what the historical Jesus said, and then teaching them additional things. We shouldn't mingle those. So unfortunately, they've got an answer to that where they'll try to say, oh no, Jesus said it was okay, but I disagree with those interpretations of Jesus' words.
Excellent. So the first half of the book that we've discussed so far was dedicated to kind of the negative case, showing that there's no real evidence of these fictionalizing literary devices, even in Greco-Roman biographies, let alone in the Gospels. But then the second half, you lay out a positive case where you argue for what you call the honest reportage model. Can you tell us your hypothesis that you intended to defend?
Yeah, so just to reiterate that, the reportage model is the idea that the authors were trying to get it right and that they were highly successful. So that's sort of my, brief version of that. And then, of course, I nuanced that in various ways. That didn't mean that they couldn't, have recognizable paraphrase of what Jesus said. And that didn't mean that they always narrated in order. So we've already talked a little bit about that, that they might group things topically or something of that kind, but that they were never deliberately changing the facts, and they were also really close to the facts so that they were able to get them right.
Excellent. We already talked a little bit about how the gospel authors claim to be reporting accurate information, but I'd like to ask, why this matters. Why does it matter that Luke says he investigated all the things before he wrote his two-part work, the Luke Acts?
Well, let's go back to what we talked about, like way back at the beginning, the minimal facts versus the maximal facts approach to the resurrection. So suppose that Luke did not investigate carefully, and he just kind of like sat around and said, hey, bring me all your stories, however crazy they are, and I'll just write them all down. He wasn't at all what we might call a careful consumer of material. Then, for all we know, the stories about Jesus appearing on the road to Emmaus, or the stories about Jesus being eating with them, for example, could have just been ones that somebody just said, hey, there's that Luke guy, he's going to write down whatever I tell him. So I'm going to go spin him this thing, and then I'll be famous. My story will make it into what he's writing about Jesus. People who were unscrupulous, or who were imaginative, or superstitious or whatever, could just make things up and tell them to Luke, and he would write it all down as fact. So I think even aside from the literary devices, it becomes important to our case for the Gospels and ultimately for Christianity that we have reason to believe that these people were scrupulous and in a position to know what they were doing. This is important for doctrine too. You were talking about how those I disagree with kind of agree with me on the major doctrines of Christianity, but it becomes interesting to see how hard it gets to defend doctrine once we start casting doubt upon the investigative care on the part of the authors. So imagine trying to teach about the Holy Spirit, for example, or the deity of Jesus, if you couldn't be sure that the teachings of Jesus recorded here are, at least quite reliable, quite highly, not necessarily absolutely inerrant, but at least as reliable as we expect people to be who are in a position to know and who are careful and so on, that they're really highly reliable. It's going to be really hard. I remember in an email recently, someone wrote to me, a theologian and apologist, and asked me about defending doctrines about Scripture from the teachings of Jesus. And this person has to some extent bought into these literary device views. And he wanted to know what I would say. And I said, you're going to need all the teaching of Jesus you can get. Because Jesus doesn't even mention Scripture all that often. I mean, he does, the Scriptures cannot be broken. He has some of these. But I said, you want all of these. You need all of those. If you're going to try to get a doctrine of Scripture from Jesus' teaching, what are you doing? I didn't quite put it quite this bluntly, but accepting these literary device views, and now you want to go defend theology from the teaching of Jesus. So that becomes difficult too. So those are just some more reasons why it is important that Luke and these others investigated from the beginning.
Excellent. So one of the primary evidences you cite is undesigned coincidences. We don't have to just take, say, Luke's word for it that he was reliable. We can put it to the test. Sometimes we can test things with archaeology, but that's not something the average person can do. The average person can only look at the text, which is one reason why these undesigned coincidences are great, because all you need is the biblical text. We talked a little bit about those already, but a lot of people have come in since then. So could you give another example of an undesigned coincidence in the Gospels?
Sure. So I'll throw in here that concerns the temple cleansing, because that's been a little bit of a theme running through our conversation. So in the temple cleansing, they come up to Jesus in John after he's cast out all these money changers, and they say, show us a sign of your authority to do this. They're kind of saying, who do you think you are? And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This also, by the way, is one of those little Johannine asides, because the narrator says then in his own voice, he said this concerning the temple of his body, that he's predicting his own resurrection. And they understand him to mean the actual physical temple. They say this temple has been built. It's been 46 years that this temple has been built, and will you raise it again in 3 days? Now, there's a more complicated one that I won't go into right now relating to the 46 years, and that's pretty cool and relates to outside history about when the temple was in fact built or began to be built. But I want to focus here on something that then comes up over in Jesus' trial in Matthew and Mark. Witnesses come in, they're trying to get him in trouble. This is when he's before the Jewish leaders in the middle of the night, and they bring in witnesses, and some of them say, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days. And when you just read that in Matthew and Mark, it's kind of hard to figure out what are they talking about, because there's nothing in Matthew and Mark where he says anything like this. Moreover, it doesn't just sound like a complete fabrication because of the raise it again in 3 days. That's a little weird if they were just trying to make up some kind of terrorist threat he made against the temple or something. We heard him say, I will destroy the temple. You'd think they would just stop right there. Why are they bringing up the raise it again in 3 days? So what it sounds like is something that he really said, but that was misunderstood or has become garbled or something like that. And so you have to then turn to John to find out what is this gossip about him raising the temple again in 3 days. What are they talking about? You find the original version of that saying over in John. So that explains the witness testimony in Matthew and Mark. So that's another example of an undesigned coincidence that, among other things, confirms John's account of the temple cleansing.
Excellent. So we can definitely see these undesigned coincidences in the text, but why do you think that your reportage model better explains them than, say, a literary devices model would?
This is sort of related to what I was talking about before with some of my professional work. When we do an undesigned coincidence, I have a professional paper that analyzes the probability theory of undesigned coincidences in an entirely secular way. And when we want to see why is an undesigned coincidence so powerful, one part of that has to do with what's called dependence, under the hypothesis that the larger accounts are true. So, like, if the larger account of the temple cleansing in John is true, and the larger account of the trial is true, then we expect that if the documents are getting it right on those larger accounts, it's just natural to us to expect that they're probably getting it right on the smaller details of the accounts as well, because they've got some kind of access, right? So if they've got that access, then we think that they might fit together more with those smaller details. We don't always find them, of course. You don't always find an undesigned coincidence, but that there's at least a better probability of this because these are truthful witnesses who have access to real events. Now, the problem with the literary device views is that they break that connection. They come along and they say, well, yeah, maybe they got it right concerning the larger account, but they thought it was fine to make up the smaller details. So they're saying this is in a certain genre where you actually literally expect that maybe the larger account is true, though, frankly, they sometimes say they made up the larger account as well. But even if the larger account is true, all bets are off concerning, in a sense, the smaller details. Well, if all bets are off concerning the smaller details, then you're not going to expect to find undesigned coincidences. And therefore, by that same token, when you do find undesigned coincidence, that tells us that all bets are not off, that they do not make up the smaller details, and the smaller details, in fact, are also literal. So that's why my reportage model is a better explanation.
Excellent. Vilna said this is a great example of the complementary nature of the Gospels. I don't think it's accidental that we have four Gospels. Skeptics often say, we need extraordinary evidence to accept this. And I think you would agree that that's not really epistemologically valid. But on the other hand, we actually do have extraordinary evidence. We have four at least partially independent accounts of a first century peasant's life that doesn't exist in any other circumstance. And if the popular view had gone its way, that we probably would only have one gospel. The Diatessaron was very popular. We have evidence that's probably more popular than the four Gospels, and it was a harmony of the four Gospels. So I think that the very fact we have four Gospels is evidence of their truth. Do you have anything you'd like to say on that?
No, I agree. I think that God did that on purpose. And aside from whether you're an inerrantist or not, I definitely think that that's a reason why God left alleged contradictions in them, or the appearance sometimes of contradiction. And this is something that J. Warner Wallace will say. He says, the people who are bringing up these theories, they've never interrogated witnesses for a living. Of course, he's a cold case detective. And he said, because that's what you will find. So I refer to this as the texture of witness testimony, that texture where you have these little things that don't necessarily fit together, but you also have things like the undesigned coincidences that do fit together. You have these casual remarks and so forth. That's very much, I think, providentially ordered for it. As far as extraordinary evidence, my husband has a funny way he does this. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but the skeptic says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I don't know what I mean by extraordinary, but whatever it is, you don't have it, therefore the resurrection didn't happen. It's all like laid out as premises, And so, we can certainly acknowledge that the claim of a miracle does require more evidence than just the claim that the sunrise rose this morning, but it turns out that's not what they mean by extraordinary evidence. And indeed, I don't think they do often know what they mean, but whatever we have, it's not going to be good enough.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect that it's just an excuse not to take anything into consideration. Veronica said the complementary nature of all the scriptures says that it is written for those who search and seek thoroughly, and amen to that. So another one of the evidences you touch upon is what you call unexplained illusions. You alluded to one of these earlier. What is an unexplained illusion, and why would that be incompatible with a literary device model?
So sometimes you might be talking to a person who's remembering an event, especially from long ago, if you've ever done any oral history, talking to someone who maybe remembers World War II or something like that, and you just kind of get them talking, and you hit the record button and you listen. They will throw in things that they don't stop to explain. And this happens in daily talk too. If someone were talking now and referred to the pandemic, and someone was reading it, from 2,000 years from now, and they might not know what the pandemic was, but the person speaking now, he knows what he means. So you just kind of say stuff, or you say down by the corner of this street and that street because you know that corner. It's in your mind. That is what I call the evidential value of casualness. That you just see these things and they don't have any theological meaning. They don't have any, if they do, it's well hidden, let's put it that way. They don't have any even literary meaning. In fact, they kind of interrupt the story. Even in a modern novel, a careful modern novelist will try to make everything fit together. Maybe they'll put in some kind of what we call foreshadowing of something that's going to happen later, but they don't usually have some event that the reader doesn't know what it means, doesn't know why you're mentioning it, and it doesn't fit up with anything else, and just kind of throw it in there randomly. So that is an evidence of truth, because it's the kind of thing we find with what we call artless reporters, where they're just kind of telling what they remember. So another example of that would be in John 2. There's a lot of these in John, I found when I started researching my John book. In John 2, it's just told the story of the wedding of Cana. And then it says, Jesus and his mother and his brothers and his disciples went down to Capernaum and stayed there for a few days. Now, this is a twofer because there's a geographical confirmation there too, because from Cana to Capernaum is down. It's downhill because you're going to the seashore. But also it's an unexplained allusion because, what were they doing? They went there and they stayed there for a few days. He just stops. And then the next thing is, and the Passover was near at hand, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. We get into the Jesus going and cleansing the temple story. So it doesn't fit with anything. It's just kind of thrown in there at random. And to me, this is the eye of the beholder. This is the mark of an almost unedited story from someone who was actually there. In fact, I would even argue that if John got that from somebody else, for example, Richard Balcom thinks he got the story of the marriage from Nathaniel, because he doesn't think the author traveled to Galilee. Well, I think the author traveled to Galilee. I mean, not that it would have to be a false story if he got it from Nathaniel, but I think this is an evidence that he didn't get it from somebody else, because if he got it from Nathaniel, why would you leave in the stupid random remark that Nathaniel made about them going to Capernaum and spending a few days, and he doesn't tell what they did there or what that was about? So that's another example of an unexplained allusion, and that's how it shows the truthfulness and the casual artlessness of the accounts.
Excellent. Villainous asks, what about archaeological anchors? He cites Pilate's name being found on a stone, ancient Christian graffiti. I would add how the archaeological evidence has shown that the various titles of rulers in the books of Acts are correct. Mm-hmm. How do you think this fits into our picture?
Well, it definitely supports the reportage model. I have a talk out there, and I think I've put it onto one of my playlists, called Acts Gets Hard Things Right. So my fondness is for the more obscure facts. The more obscure, the better. So, Pilate is great, and actually he wasn't all that famous anyway, but, it's not so much, oh, hey, it mentioned Caesar Augustus. Well, anybody can mention Caesar Augustus, but something that's very obscure. And so the book of Acts is like this, like you said, names of the types of titles of the rulers in the cities and stuff. There was no Google where you could look this up. There was no Alexa, hey, tell me what the ruler of Ephesus would be called or whatever. So these are really strong evidences that we find in inscriptions and in like documents, obscure documents and so forth. And I would definitely encourage people to look up that Axe Gets Hard Things Right talk for more of these, because they confirm that kind of rootedness in the facts and in the time and place.
Excellent. The other comment I wanted to make is that the Gospel of John in particular was heavily criticized by the 18th and 19th century critics of Christianity. They used their presuppositions, which they thought were objective facts, and they basically concluded it had to be written in the late 2nd century, 3rd, maybe even 4th century, that there's no way this could be a 1st century document. And of course, that view is completely destroyed now because of the manuscript evidence. And I think there's definitely a trend in scholarship that people are re-examining John. They're coming to the realization that John probably is an accurate and independent account of Jesus's life, that it's not just a made-up theological document from much later on. And, I'm very excited about your upcoming book, which will focus on John. You want to tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so this is going to be called The Eye of the Beholder, and I'm very excited about it. And what I do is something a little different from what I think anybody has done before, even though I am using the work of earlier scholars like Craig Blomberg, D.A. Carson, those kinds of scholars. But what I'm doing is I'm focusing on arguments against John that have convinced some evangelicals. So it's like that's how I'm picking them. So if it's something that you might consider to be way out there, that, so for example, there's a very liberal scholar named Maurice Casey who says the Gospel of John is anti-Semitic. So that's not something I spend a lot of time on, is that claim. But I do spend a lot of time on the claim that Jesus sounds different in John than he does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's something that's just impressed so many people, that the Jesus of John, he has a different voice, he talks different. And I refute the claim. In certain ways, I say, actually, it doesn't sound nearly as different as you've been told. Some of these things I call them myths, and they kind of grow in the telling, So, for example, this idea that Jesus has 7 I am discourses, and that in these 7 I am discourses, they all start with an I am saying, and then they go on, expounding that I am saying for many verses. It's not even... There are hardly any that even meet that description in the Gospel of John. Maybe the bread of life discourse, but there really aren't very many. So various myths that I'm exploding. That's how I'm picking my arguments to debunk. And so I'm doing that for quite a number of chapters, with a special focus on the voice of Jesus in John and the discourses. And then I'm also, sort of like I did in The Mirror of the Mask, then I bring in a lot of positive evidence, and I'm reviving things that were done by somewhat older authors like Brooke Foss Westcott, Leon Morris, the late Leon Morris. I'm bringing in these kinds of J.B. Lightfoot, these kinds of arguments that have somewhat fallen out of favor. And what I'm arguing for is something very robust. It ends up being much more robust than the sort of new look on John that you were just mentioning. And that new look on John it's real. It's happening in mainstream scholarship. But I believe that there's what I might call a hard line, a sort of a limit. And that it's only going to come up to, it's going to approach that limit. Mathematicians talk about approaching asymptotically. It's going to get closer and closer, but it's going to stop well short. Over here, yeah, but John still made up a lot of Jesus speeches, and John still is a lot less historical somehow than the synoptics, and that's where it's going to end. Like, we can't go full reportage model for John. And I'm not just talking about inerrancy. I mean, even just like John never made up anything deliberately, that's going to be considered too conservative. And I think what sometimes happened is that some of the scholars I'm disagreeing with will actually talk about that new look on John that you talked about, but they have a false idea in their minds that we need to go meet the mainstream scholars. So the mainstream scholars, they're coming this way. They're accepting more and more historicity in John. So we need to go kind of meet them and accept a certain amount of historicity in John, and then we'll meet somewhere. And I'm not doing that. Like, I'm just saying, no, yes, scholarship on John was bent way over to one side. It was crazy. Fine. We need to bring it back over to what the evidence really supports, which is a much, much more historical view. So I'm defending that strong forward reportage model concerning the Gospel of John. And I'm really excited. I hope it'll be out sometime, hopefully, Lord willing, in March of 2021.
Excellent. We have like 15 or 20 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I thought it'd be helpful to maybe walk through a few examples of these supposed literary devices in the Gospels and how a simpler explanation is usually better in these cases. So you categorize these in 4 different categories. The first one is utterly unforced errors. Can you give us an example of something that well, first define what you mean by utterly unforced errors, and then give it an example and why you think that it's totally silly for a scholar to assert this.
Yeah, so I call something an utterly unforced error when there isn't an apparent discrepancy. So the scholar just kind of looks out there and sees something that's just a mere, maybe a difference. Maybe it's found in one gospel but not in another, and then just says, oh, hey, maybe one of the authors changed something or made something up. So an example here would be in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me, when he's on the cross. And we don't find that saying in the Gospel of John, but we do find him saying, I am thirsty, I thirst, on the cross. And so Daniel B. Wallace has suggested this, and then following him, Michael Licona has suggested that John made up I thirst, I am thirsty, as a transformation of my God, why have you forsaken me. And there's no contradiction. Like, he's on the cross, he can certainly say both of these. There's no apparent contradiction between these. So I call that an utterly unforced error, that you're just sort of out of the blue. And the kinds of arguments that Wallace would give as well, but Jesus' cross is his glorification in John. Well, I mean, as Richard Balcom has put it, the glory does not cancel the shame. Everybody knew how horrible crucifixion was, and that you would be terribly thirsty. Thirst would be one of the part of the torture of crucifixion. So why would you even hypothesize such a thing? So it's this heavily theological, unmotivated hypothesis. And I think people can just kind of see on its face, why would you do that? Why would you think that? And that's what I mean by an utterly unforced error.
Yeah, kind of, scholars getting a little too creative and trying to tie things that don't appear to have any resemblance at all for no apparent reason. Mm-hmm. Your second category is fictions only need apply. Can you give an example, or define that and give an example?
Yeah, so an example of that would be when when Jairus is the man whose daughter needs to be healed. And I don't remember if I put that in that chapter in the book. I think I did. His daughter is dying, and he comes to Jesus and he says, my daughter is dying. And Jesus says he'll come. Well, in one gospel, he says, my daughter is dying. But in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, my daughter has just died. So this is seen as a contradiction. Did he say she's dying, or did he say she's just died? And then, of course, these are very similar wordings. And so then the theory that has become popular is that Matthew deliberately said, I know that he said she's dying, but I'm going to make him say she's just died in my story because I don't want to bother telling about the servants who come later and tell that she's dead. So I'm going to change it to make it that she was already dead at that time. And then I don't have to tell about the servants. well, I just consider this to be unnecessary theorizing. So, for example, he could have just left the servants out and not have reported that, he could have had him say, my daughter is dying, and then just not have the servants come. Why do you don't have to change the words to do that. But a theory that my husband has suggested that I think is reasonable is that he's like very upset, and he says, my daughter is dying. She's just died. She's probably just died, especially since it's taken him a while, to come and get to Jesus. He's very upset, very anxious. She's dying. She's probably just died. So he may have said both of them. And one author remembered one and one author remembered another. Another theory, again, if you're not trying to defend inerrancy, would be that Matthew just remembered it a little bit differently. The two sound very similar. My daughter is dying. My daughter has died. That he might have been standing a little further away and heard it differently, and reported it the way he remembered it. And then that shows that he's not just copying it, not just copying it from some common source, that he's got his own way of remembering it. You might consider that to be incompatible with inerrancy, but if we're just looking at it history, this would be, I think, reasonable. But these are not hypotheses that these scholars take with any seriousness, and I think that's a shame, because then they're only considering deliberate alteration. I think you're still muted.
Indeed. So Don's watching the tube, asks, why bend over to please a scholar that has made something up? Jesus was on the cross for hours and obviously said more than what is recorded. So the relevant question here isn't, why give an answer for this particular case, but why give an answer at all? Why address these people who are making what most people would say is just ridiculous conclusion?
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought about that. Our life is short, right? I didn't have to write The Mirror of the Mask. It's a long book, and I put a lot of time into it, and I'm doing the same with The Eye of the Beholder. But the way I look at it is these books are treasure houses, and I use that metaphor in The Eye of the Beholder, that the Gospel of John is like a treasure chamber filled with treasure that God intended us to have. And I feel that these theories, as they become increasingly popular, are telling us not to avail ourselves of that treasure, that we're sort of supposed to kind of keep our arm's distance from it because we don't know if it's real or if we're allowed to take it. And I think that's a real shame. And I think it's these things, I see them becoming more popular. Pastors, seminaries, and so forth that are bringing these in. And a lot of times they're bringing them in without knowing what they're bringing in. There's something of a Trojan horse aspect to it, that they'll say, oh, well, we just want to understand the gospel authors as they understood themselves. And these literary devices are just that they sometimes paraphrased or something. It's something that sounds completely harmless. And so then they do a whole class or a whole conference, or they make their students study this as an authoritative textbook or something like that. And then the pastors go out, and then that's what they're telling their people in the pews. And so it is growing in its influence. And so I'm trying to provide a counterweight and a counter voice. I think when people start to see that these things are kind of silly, then they'll say, oh, okay, this isn't something that I have to accept because that's this great scholar and I don't have the qualifications to disagree with him. When they hear what even sometimes what the theories actually are, that will make them say, well, I know Jesus said, I thirst. And this theory about Jesus' crucifixion being glory, that's just some guy living in his ivory tower making up this theory. When I was giving a talk on this, someone told me, a man in the audience leaned over and said to his wife, these guys need to get out more. And that's what I'm trying to do. I want people who hear this to say these guys need to get out more.
This is a humorous comment here from Balzetti Blaster. He says that he read theology in London in the 70s. The governing principle then was demytholization. He always said he would want to write a book called Remytholizing the New Testament. And of course, the this idea of literary devices, I think, is kind of a new version of an old trend. That the old trend was historical Jesus scholarship, that everyone wanted to find the real historical Jesus. Well, now everyone wants to say, well, we know that these particular passages weren't historically spoken. And in your interview with Mike Winger, he put this well. He said, in the end, it just becomes a license to see whatever you want in Jesus. That if you like a particular passage, you can say, well, that was a historical event. That's something that Jesus really did. And if you don't like something, well, that wasn't the real Jesus. And then you create a Jesus in your own image, so to speak. Any comment on that?
I think there's truth to that. D.A. Carson has a phrase he uses, without objective control. And when he's criticizing a view, he'll say, this approach is without objective control. And I think I've shown that here by some of the examples I've given, that these theories are without objective control. And I think that's what you're getting at. I think that's related to the idea of there not being a tag in the text, that we don't have an objective way of telling the difference, nor did the original audience. In fact, what I've often found is the lists of these alleged literary devices, they seem to follow. It's interesting to see how they seem to follow what the liberal scholars have questioned. So if a liberal scholar doesn't choose to question the historicity of a given event, then you won't find a literary device theory about it. But if a liberal scholar has chosen to question one, then you'll find a literary device theory. And that causes, I think, people who don't come with that background knowledge of the liberal scholarship to say, why in the world are they picking that one to question? And I think this is definitely true with the unforced errors. I'll give another example real quick of that. When Jesus breathes on his disciples and he says, receive the Holy Spirit after he's raised from the dead, Dr. Licona strongly suggests that John invented this to weave something like Pentecost into his narrative. And sometimes they use the phrase the Johannine Pentecost. Well, of course, to a naive reader who just knows the Bible, this doesn't look like Pentecost at all. At Pentecost, there was a rushing mighty wind. There were tongues of fire. Jesus was already ascended. He wasn't standing there. This is this private little intimate gathering where he just breathes on, those disciples and says some words, and it's kind of mysterious, but it doesn't look like Pentecost at all. And so where is that coming from? This isn't coming from some kind of objective scholarly recognition. Aha, that looks like a genre, a literary compositional device that I found over here, and it's got these tags, and that's how I tell. It's nothing like that. Where this comes from is a fad in the mainstream scholarship to give this a name, the Johannine Pentecost, and then to start talking to each other. Maybe John made this up. He's trying to allude he wasn't going to narrate Pentecost. And it's like there's all this literature out there on it, and it's all nonsense, in my opinion. And then what Dr. Licona is just doing is coming and calling it, literary artistry or the genre of Greco-Roman bio that gave them license. He's just putting a label on top of something. And if you think that is mutual support, I get the feeling they think of this as a cumulative case. Oh, look, other scholars have seen it too. And it's like, no, you're just following the other scholars who had no reason to question it in the first place either. So I think that fits with what you're saying about it being without objective control.
Excellent. Villainous said people don't want to find a mythological Jesus, so they don't have to face the real one. And amen to that. So your third category of examples of these literary devices is what you call overreading. Can you define overreading and give a quick example?
Sure. So here would be one. There's a place where Matthew talks about, I think it's Matthew, talks about the causing any little one who believes in Jesus to stumble, and it would be better if a millstone were tied around his neck and he were cast into the sea. And then Luke has a very similar saying, and it may be the same occasion, it may be a different occasion, but he doesn't give the same context where Jesus places a child among them and then says this, among other things that he says, that someone causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better, etc. So Luke doesn't have that narrative context surrounding it. And what Dr. Lacona says is that Luke has moved this saying out of its narrative context to a different point in Jesus' ministry, and then that he suffered something that he calls, borrowing this from a scholar named Mark Goodacre, editorial fatigue, that he forgot to take out the phrase, these little ones, and then when you read the Luke passage, you say, what little ones? There aren't any little ones in the context. And that's just great. That's a sign that Luke has moved it. And what he's failing to notice is that Luke doesn't say when this happened. When you actually read the passage, and I discussed this in the Mirror of the Mask, you see that this is in one of those heap sections where Luke is definitely narrating achronologically. He's not saying when this happened. He puts these heap sections later on in his gospel, but he doesn't say at all when this happened. And so, yeah, he's, even if it is the same account or something of the same saying, Luke isn't moving anything because he isn't even giving us a context. So this whole idea of editorial fatigue and Luke moving and so forth, that's all over reading the passage in Luke. And that's just one example. There are a lot of them.
Excellent. The final chapter of your book before you go to the conclusion, and then there's some appendices, but the final main chapter is on the resurrection. And I think that's a great place to end. The resurrection, of course, is the thing that the skeptic is going to attack the most because it's the most important thing to Christianity. And we do definitely see differences in the resurrection accounts. My first comment would be that this is actually a good thing. For much of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they kind of follow the same outline. They probably had some shared sources. The exact relationship between them isn't important, but there's probably some sort of literary relationship. But then when you get to the resurrection accounts, they seem to differ. They seem to all go their own way, perhaps giving us not just 2, but 4 independent accounts of the resurrection. So could you talk a little bit about how people have seen literary devices in the resurrection accounts, and why you think that's definitely not a good idea to use that to support our apologetics?
Yeah, so it's not a good idea for all of the reasons we've discussed, because it's going to undermine our apologetic, but I also think it's poor history, and it's not going at it the way that you ought to evaluate history. So here would be an example. Matthew talks about the women coming to the tomb at the beginning of Matthew 28, and he only names 2 of them, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And then from then on, he just says they. They got there and they saw this and they saw the angel. They were running away and they saw Jesus and so forth. Now, if you assume that Mary Magdalene is there the whole time for all of those they, you will assume that she saw Jesus first when they're leaving the tomb, after they've already seen the angels in it. Since they're running away with great joy, so they're in that kind of mood. They're happy and everything, although, pretty stunned, I'm sure, but they've just spoken to the angels. And then Jesus appears to them and they clutch his feet and so forth. So that would be how Mary Magdalene saw Jesus, if you assume she's still with the other women. If you go to John 20, you find that Mary comes to the tomb. Now, it doesn't mention the other women, but later she uses the word we. We don't know where they've laid him. So it's clear that she did have other women with her when she comes to the tomb. And she gets there, and it says she sees the stone taken away. Then she runs and comes to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved and so forth. So Mary Magdalene leaves the tomb at that point. And then later she comes back, apparently with Peter and John. I believe it's John, the beloved disciple. And she's outside weeping. And she doesn't believe that Jesus has risen. She hasn't received this joyful news that Jesus has risen. And then she sees Jesus, and they have this dialogue. She says, "Oh, sir, if you know where he is, let me take him away. And I will bury him. Let me take him." And he just says her name, Mary. And then she recognizes him. It's one of the most beautiful scenes in all of Scripture. This, of course, is different from the way that the women see Jesus in Matthew. So some have thought that there's a contradiction here, that in Matthew, Mary Magdalene sees him with the other women. She's joyful. She's already accepted the angel's word that he's risen. Whereas in John, she's alone. She's sad. She doesn't believe he's already risen. That's a contradiction. And Dr. Lacona, in his section on the resurrection in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, says either Matthew or John has relocated the appearance to Mary Magdalene. And that word relocated is kind of interesting. It's one of those, I call them euphemisms. They're euphemisms. It's as though one of them is talking about it happening right in front of the tomb, and the other one is talking about it happening 3 feet to the left. You know, he just relocated it. But when you really look into it, if this was really relocating, then one or the other of them made a major change. And this is part of what I mean when I say these are not all just tiny little details, because if John did this relocating, he made up a whole scene, obviously. I don't see that that's the best way to do it. I think when we approach accounts, as J. Warner Wallace says, if you question witnesses, you think of them in that way, it's responsible history to try to put them together. That's not because we're desperate and we're Christians and, oh my goodness, we can't admit any error. It's because we are trying to kind of put this evidence together. There's a judge who's been reading my book on John, and is going to blurb it. And he's a British judge, and he also did a PhD in theology, I believe, and his dissertation was on differences in the resurrection accounts, which was really cool as a judge, you know. And so he talks about that we need to try to accommodate as much of our evidence as we can. That's a responsible way to investigate something. That's how a judge thinks. So if we're trying to accommodate our evidence, I think what we can see is that Mary leaves the group. And I often say that the New Testament scholars see the gospel scenes as if they're snapshots, but real life is a videotape. So you have a snapshot of Mary coming to the tomb with the other women, but real life is a videotape, and it keeps going, and she leaves. So Matthew has all these they, but that refers to the other women. Now, Matthew may not have known that she left the group, and you can decide how that fits with your view of inerrancy. If Matthew didn't happen to know, he doesn't mention, he may not know that she left the group, but he knew that a group of women went on and saw the angel and then saw Jesus when they were running away. Whether he knew that Mary had already left or not, we don't know, but that's a good explanation of the evidence that she left the group. And then in John, we follow sort of the videotape in John follows her line of vision. The videotape in Matthew follows the rest of the women's line of vision and what happened to them. I think that's a really economical way to take all the evidence into account. And that's a more responsible approach than saying that one or the other just invented this way that Mary Magdalene saw Jesus.
Excellent. We're going to wrap up now, but I just wanted to read a couple comments from the audience. As Truth Apologetics says, I came in late, but this conversation has been incredibly enlightening. And then Balzacchetti says, this is a cheerful, enthusiastic, intelligent Christian scholar, and this has been a joy. And I have to agree that this was excellent talk. I really enjoyed it myself. I would definitely encourage everyone to check out Lydia's YouTube channel and get a copy of the Mirror of the Mask book. The book is filled with tons of primary source information, so you can go and find the support for the things we're saying. You don't just have to take our word for it. You can look at the sources for yourself. And then finally, Islamic Clarity says this is such an important topic, and I agree. I'd like to give the final word to Lydia, but real quickly, I'd also like to say that I will be live on Wednesday. I believe it's 3 o'clock Eastern. I'll be talking with Anthony Rogers and Io from the Third Apology, and we will be addressing the subject of answering Muslim objections to the Trinity. So
well, thank you so much. Thanks so much
yeah.
for having me, Thaddeus. This has been a lot of fun, and I just want to encourage people that God has not left himself without witness, as the Bible says. And so we've got that evidence there. Just go out and investigate it. There's so much that I can't even begin. I can only give you a little taste of it here, the evidence for the truth of Christianity. So thanks so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you all for watching, and God bless.